Trapped in a snowy mansion, a young heiress, Clara, collapses at a Christmas feast, poisoned by a deadly plum pudding. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets, hidden passages, a stolen formula, and a killer among the guests. As clues pile up, from a mysterious locket to a glass dropper, Jane sets a trap, revealing a shocking truth of revenge and betrayal. Will she catch the murderer before the snow melts? Chapter 1. The Call to Winterbrook. Hall Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking like a soft heartbeat. The fire crackled, casting warm shadows on the walls, where framed pictures of her nephew Raymond and his family smiled down. A chilly November breeze slipped through the window, carrying the scent of damp leaves. She was halfway through a wool scarf for Raymond's new baby when the postman's knock broke her thoughts. A thick envelope slid through the mail slot, landing with a soft thud on the mat. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her fingers stiff from the cold. She picked up the letter, noting the elegant handwriting and the crest of Winterbrook Hall, a grand estate in Gloucestershire. The letter was from Lady Beatrice Harrowfield, an old friend from her school days, whose sharp wit and kind heart had always charmed Jane. They hadn't spoken in years, not since a garden party in London, where Beatrice's laughter had rung out over the roses. The letter was an invitation to a Christmas gathering at Winterbrook Hall, but its tone held a shadow. "Dear Jane," it read, "your clever eyes see what others miss. I feel a strangeness here, a puzzle I cannot solve. Come for Christmas, won't you? I need your quiet wisdom." Jane's lips curved into a small smile. Beatrice was no fool. If she sensed trouble, it was real. The idea of a mystery, wrapped in the glow of a Christmas celebration, stirred Jane's curiosity. She loved the quiet of St. Mary Mead, but a trip to Winterbrook Hall promised new faces, new stories, and perhaps a knot to untangle. She penned a quick reply, packed a modest suitcase with her warmest shawl and a few books, and booked a train ticket for the next day. As she locked her cottage door, the village church bells chimed, and she felt a tingle of excitement, like a young girl off on an adventure. The train to Gloucestershire chugged through frosty fields, the windows fogging with Jane's breath as she gazed at the rolling hills. Snow dusted the landscape, turning hedgerows into soft white mounds. She shared her carriage with a chatty vicar, who spoke of his parish's Christmas pageant. But Jane's mind wandered to Winterbrook Hall. She recalled Beatrice's tales of the estate, a sprawling Victorian manor with tall chimneys, ivy-covered, walls and a ballroom where lords and ladies once danced under crystal chandeliers. Beatrice had inherited it from her late husband, Sir Henry Harrowfield, a man known for his love of rare books and fine brandy. Jane wondered what trouble could lurk in such a grand place. At the station, a driver in a wool coat waited with a sign bearing her name. He was a young man, Tom, with ruddy cheeks and a shy smile, who tipped his cap and took her suitcase. The drive to Winterbrook Hall wound through narrow lanes, the car's wheels crunching on fresh snow. Tom spoke little, but Jane coaxed out that he'd worked for Beatrice 3 years, tending the stables and driving guests. "It's a fine place, miss," he said, "but folks are tense lately. Don't know why." Jane nodded, her sharp eyes catching the way his hands tightened on the wheel. Winterbrook Hall loomed into view as the car crested a hill. Its stone towers pierced the grey sky, and its windows glowed like warm eyes against the snow. Ivy clung to the walls, giving the manor a timeless air, as if it had grown from the earth itself. The driveway circled a fountain, frozen into a sparkling sculpture. Tom helped Jane out, and she felt the cold bite her cheeks as she climbed the steps to the grand oak door. It swung open, revealing Beatrice Harrowfield, her silver hair pinned neatly, her green eyes bright despite the lines of worry around them. "Jane, my dear." Beatrice clasped her hands, her voice warm but strained. "You're a sight for sore eyes. Come in, warm yourself." The hall was a marvel. A high ceiling with carved beams, a marble floor gleaming under a chandelier, and a grand staircase curving upward. A fire roared in a massive hearth, and the air smelled of pine and polished wood. Beatrice led Jane to a sitting room, where tea waited on a silver tray. As they sipped, Beatrice's smile faded. "I'm so glad you're here," she said softly. "Something's wrong, Jane. I can't put my finger on it, but the house feels heavy, like a storm's coming." Jane tilted her head, her calm gaze encouraging Beatrice to say more. "It's the guests," Beatrice went on. "My nephew Victor's here with his fiancée, Clara. Then there's Dr. Quill, Mrs. Gray, and Mr. Tate. They're all lovely in their way, but there's tension. Arguments, whispers. I fear something dreadful." Jane patted her friend's hand, her mind already sorting the names. Victor, Clara, Dr. Quill, Mrs. Gray, Mr. Tate. She pictured them like pieces on a chessboard, each with a role yet to be revealed. Beatrice showed Jane to her room, a cosy chamber with a 4-poster bed and a view of the snowy gardens. As Jane unpacked, she thought about the guests. Victor Harrowfield, Beatrice's nephew, was a barrister, she recalled, known for his charm, but rumoured to have money troubles. Clara, his fiancée, was an heiress, her wealth tied to her late father's business. Dr. Quill was the local doctor, a man Beatrice had once described as too curious about things best left alone. Mrs. Gray, a widow, was sharp-tongued and fond of gossip. Mr. Tate, a businessman, had a cheerful manner that hid something, Beatrice had hinted years ago. Jane's knack for remembering details, honed by years of village life, told her these people were the key to the puzzle. That evening, Jane joined the guests in the dining room for a light supper before the Christmas Eve feast. The room was grand, with long windows framing the snow outside and a table set with gleaming silver. Victor Harrowfield stood by the fire, his dark hair slicked back, his smile bright but his eyes restless. He greeted Jane with a bow, his voice smooth. "Miss Marple, Aunt Beatrice speaks highly of you. I hope you enjoy our little gathering." Clara Merton beside him was a delicate girl with wide blue eyes and a nervous habit of twisting her bracelet. She murmured a shy hello, her gaze darting to Victor. Dr. Ernest Quill, a thin man with sharp features and glasses, nodded politely. His hands fidgeted with a pocket watch, and Jane noticed a faint ink stain on his cuff, suggesting late-night studies. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, dressed in black silk, offered a thin smile, her eyes scanning Jane like a hawk sizing up prey. "A village spinster, are you?" she said, her tone sharp but curious. Jane smiled sweetly, unfazed. Roger Tate, a stout man with a booming laugh, clapped his hands. "Miss Marple, you'll love the pudding tomorrow. Elsie, our cook, makes it like no other." His cheer felt forced, and Jane caught a flicker of unease in his eyes. The household staff moved quietly, led by Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, whose stern face and tight bun gave her an air of authority. Elsie, the young cook, brought in a tray of scones, her hands trembling slightly. Jane's keen eyes noted everything. Victor's grip on Clara's arm, Clara's quick glance at Dr. Quill, Mrs. Gray's smirk at Roger's joke, and Mrs. Dobbs's frown as Elsie dropped a spoon. The room buzzed with unspoken words, like a hive ready to swarm. After supper, Beatrice took Jane on a tour of the hall. They passed a library filled with leather-bound books, a ballroom with a dusty chandelier, and a conservatory where exotic plants thrived despite the cold. In the kitchen, Elsie was kneading dough, her cheeks flushed. "Tomorrow's pudding's nearly ready, ma'am," she told Beatrice. "Just needs the brandy sauce." Jane sniffed the air, catching the sweet tang of plums and spices. The kitchen was tidy, but a locked pantry door caught her eye. "Who keeps the key?" she asked casually. "I do," Mrs. Dobbs said, her voice firm, patting her apron pocket. Back in the sitting room, Beatrice shared more about the guests. Victor, she said, had borrowed heavily to keep up his London lifestyle, and Clara's inheritance was his lifeline. Clara, though sweet, seemed haunted, perhaps by her father's sudden death a year ago. Dr. Quill had a habit of collecting rare herbs, some said for experiments beyond medicine. Mrs. Gray, widowed young, lived off her late husband's estate, but loved stirring trouble. Roger Tate, a merchant who'd made his fortune in India, had ties to Clara's father. Though Beatrice didn't know the details, Jane listened, her mind weaving a web of motives and secrets. As night fell, Jane sat by her bedroom window, watching snowflakes dance in the moonlight. The hall was quiet, but she felt the weight Beatrice described. It wasn't just the guests. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. She thought of her village, where small quarrels often hid deeper truths. People were the same everywhere, she knew, driven by love, fear, greed, or shame. Somewhere in this grand house, a secret was festering, and Jane's sharp mind was already at work, picking at the threads. She opened her suitcase and took out her knitting, the needles a comfort in her hands. As she worked, she recalled a story from St. Mary Mead, a farmer's wife who'd poisoned her husband's tea, thinking no one would notice. The signs were there, in her too bright smile, and the way she avoided the teapot. Jane wondered if the adieu signs were here too. In a glance, a word, a locked door. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, with its grand feast and flaming pudding. If trouble was coming, it would show itself soon. Jane tucked herself into bed, the fire's glow fading to embers. She didn't pray for answers. She trusted her eyes and ears for that. But she did hope for a good night's sleep, knowing tomorrow would demand all her wits. As she drifted off, the wind howled outside, and somewhere in Winterbrook Hall a floorboard creaked, too soft for anyone but a mouse to hear. Or perhaps, Jane thought, someone who didn't want to be heard. Chapter 2. The Feast and the Fall. The dining room at Winterbrook Hall glowed with the warmth of a dozen candles, their flames dancing in silver holders along the long oak table. Snow pressed against the tall windows, turning them into frosted, mirrors that reflected the festive scene. Miss Jane Marple sat near the head of the table, her grey shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her eyes sharp despite her gentle smile. The Christmas Eve feast was in full swing, and the air buzzed with clinking glasses, soft laughter, and the rich scents of roasted goose, spiced wine, and the star of the evening. A plum pudding, its dark surface glistening under a crown of holly. Lady Beatrice Harrowfield, at the table's head, raised her glass, her silver hair catching the candlelight. "To friends, old and new," she said, her voice warm but tinged with strain. The guests echoed her toast, their faces a mix of cheer and shadow. Jane watched them closely, her knitting tucked away for now, her mind as busy as the servants bustling around the room. Victor Harrowfield, Beatrice's nephew, sat to her right, his handsome face bright with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His fiancée, Clara Merton, picked at her food, her delicate fingers twisting a napkin into knots. Dr. Ernest Quill, the local physician, adjusted his glasses, his gaze lingering on the pudding, as if it held a secret. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, the sharp-tongued widow, sipped her wine with a smirk, her eyes darting between guests like a cat watching mice. Roger Tate, the jolly businessman, laughed too loudly at his own jokes. His ruddy cheeks flushed with more than just wine. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dobbs, moved with quiet efficiency, her stern face softened by the festive mood. She directed Elsie, the young cook, who carried in the pudding on a silver tray, its brandy sauce flaming blue as the guests clapped. Elsie's hands shook slightly, and Jane noted the girl's quick glance toward Mrs. Dobbs, as if seeking approval. The pudding was sliced, its rich aroma filling the room, and each guest received a generous portion. Jane took a small bite, savouring the sweet tang of plums and the warm kick of brandy, but her attention stayed on the others. Victor leaned toward Clara, murmuring something that made her blush, though her smile was tight. Dr. Quill ate slowly, his fork pausing mid-air as he studied his plate. Mrs. Gray pushed her pudding aside, claiming it was too rich for my taste, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Roger, meanwhile, dug in with gusto, praising Elsie's skill between bites. Jane's eyes flicked to the servants' door, where Mrs. Dobbs stood, her arms crossed, watching the scene like a hawk. Something about the housekeeper's stillness felt heavy, like a cloud before a storm. The meal continued with talk of Christmas traditions and village gossip. Beatrice shared a story of her childhood, when her father hid a silver coin in the pudding for luck. Victor laughed, saying he hoped for a coin to pay his tailor. Clara's giggle was nervous, and Jane noticed her hand tremble as she reached for her glass. Dr. Quill, usually quiet, spoke of a rare herb he'd found in the hills, his words precise, but his tone distracted. Mrs. Gray steered the conversation to Clara's late father, a wealthy chemist, her voice dripping with curiosity. "Such a clever man," she said. "Did he leave you any of his secrets, dear?" Clara paled, mumbling a vague reply, and Jane's ears pricked up. Secrets, she thought, were often the root of trouble. Then it happened. Clara set down her spoon, her face suddenly as white as the snow outside. She clutched her throat, her eyes wide with panic. A choked gasp escaped her lips, and she slumped forward, her glass tipping over with a crash. The room froze, Victor leapt to his feet, shouting her name, his chair scraping the floor. Dr. Quill was at Clara's side in an instant, his fingers on her wrist, his face grim. "She's not breathing," he said, his voice sharp. He sniffed the air near. Her lips and his eyes narrowed. "Cyanide! I smell almonds!" Chaos erupted. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Victor knelt by Clara, shaking her gently, his voice breaking. Mrs. Gray stood, her chair toppling, her usual smirk gone. Roger's face drained of colour, his fork clattering to the table. Mrs. Dobbs rushed forward, barking orders at Elsie to fetch water, but Dr. Quill shook his head. "It's too late," he said. "She's gone." Jane sat still, her heart heavy, but her mind racing. She watched each face, catching the shock, the fear, and in one pair of eyes a flicker of something else. Relief? Guilt? She couldn't be sure, but she stored it away, like a stitch in her knitting. Beatrice, trembling, called for the police. But Tom, the driver, appeared at the door, his coat dusted with snow. "Lines are down, ma'am," he said. "Storms cut the roads too. No one's getting in or out till morning." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, trapped in the grand hall with a dead woman and a killer among them. Jane's calm gaze swept the room, noting the pudding plates, some half-eaten, others untouched. Hers was fine, as was Beatrice's. Victor's was barely touched, Roger's nearly gone. Dr. Quill's plate was clean, and Mrs. Gray's pudding sat untouched, a perfect slice beside her wineglass. Jane spoke softly, her voice cutting through the panic. "We must keep everything as it is. The pudding, the plates, the kitchen. The police will need to see it all." Beatrice nodded, her face pale but trusting. Mrs. Dobbs, however, bristled. "The kitchen's already been cleared, Miss Marple. We can't leave dirty dishes about." Jane's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "Please, Mrs. Dobbs, nothing must be touched." The housekeeper hesitated, then nodded, her lips tight. Victor, still kneeling by Clara, looked up, his eyes wet. "Who would do this?" he whispered. She was everything." His voice cracked, but Jane noticed his hands, clenched not in grief, but in something harder, like anger. Dr. Quill stood, adjusting his glasses, his face a mask of professional calm. "Cyanide acts fast," he said. "It was in the pudding, or the sauce. We all ate it, but only Clara." He trailed off, his eyes flicking to the table. Jane followed his gaze, noting the brandy jug, its amber liquid catching the candlelight. Mrs. Gray's voice cut in, sharp and accusing. "The cook, Elsie. She made the pudding, didn't she? Where is she?" Elsie, hovering by the door, burst into tears. "I didn't do nothing wrong," she cried. "I made it like always. Plums, sugar, brandy, I swear." Mrs. Dobbs put a hand on Elsie's shoulder, her face stern but protective. "The girl's been with me all day. She's no killer." Jane nodded, her mind turning to the pantry, the locked door she'd seen yesterday. Who had access? Who had a reason? Beatrice, regaining her composure, suggested moving Clara's body to a spare room until the police arrived. Dr. Quill and Victor carried her gently, laying her on a bed in a small chamber off the hall. Beatrice locked the door, pocketing the key. "No one goes in," she said firmly. Jane approved, knowing evidence could vanish in a house full of secrets. She asked to see the kitchen, and Beatrice led her there, the other guests trailing behind, their whispers filling the air like static. The kitchen was warm, its copper pots gleaming in the lamplight. The pudding's remains sat on a counter, a few slices left in the dish. Jane leaned close, sniffing carefully. A faint bitter scent lingered, not the sweet brandy she'd expected. "Like almonds," she murmured, echoing Dr. Quill's words. She looked at Elsie, who was wiping her eyes with her apron. "Did you add anything special to the sauce, Elsie?" The girl shook her head. "Just brandy, miss, from the bottle in the pantry." Jane's eyes flicked to the locked pantry door. "May I see inside?" she asked. Mrs. Dobbs hesitated, then pulled a key from her apron and opened the door. The pantry was tidy, shelves lined with jars of preserves, sacks of flour, and a bottle of brandy, half empty. Jane sniffed it, catching the same bitter scent. "This needs to be kept safe," she said. Mrs. Dobbs nodded, locking the pantry again. Jane's mind whirred. Cyanide wasn't a kitchen staple. Someone had brought it here, mixed it with the brandy sauce, and served it to Clara. But why her? And how did it miss the others? Back in the dining room, the guests sat in uneasy silence. Victor stared at his hands, his jaw tight. Mrs. Gray sipped her wine, her eyes darting to Dr. Quill, who stood by the window gazing at the snow. Roger tried to lighten the mood, offering a weak joke about the weather, but no one laughed. Jane sat quietly, her hands folded, her mind sorting the pieces. Clara's wealth was no secret. Her father's fortune was vast, and Victor stood to gain through their marriage. But Jane sensed more. Clara's nervous glances, Mrs. Gray's pointed questions, Dr. Quill's interest in the pudding, they all hinted at hidden threads. Beatrice joined Jane by the fire, her voice low. "Clara's father was a chemist, you know. He worked with dangerous things, poisons, medicines. Clara inherited his papers, but she never spoke of them." Jane nodded, recalling Mrs. Gray's comment about secrets. Had Clara known something valuable, something worth killing for? She thought of Dr. Quill's ink-stained cuff, his talk of herbs. A doctor would know poisons, she mused, but so might others. As the evening wore on, the guests drifted to their rooms, the house settling into a heavy quiet. Jane stayed by the fire, her eyes on the pudding plates still on the table. She noticed something odd. Clara's plate had a smear of sauce, more than the others, as if someone had poured extra. She filed it away, knowing small details often cracked big cases. In St. Mary Mead, she'd once solved a theft by noticing a smudge of jam on a glove. Here, the smudge was poison, and the stakes were deadly. Jane rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and made her way to the kitchen again. The servants were gone, the room dark, except for a single lamp. She examined the pudding dish, the brandy jug, the counter. A tiny speck of white powder caught her eye, near the sink. She touched it, rubbing it between her fingers. It was gritty, not sugar. She wrapped it in her handkerchief, her heart quickening. Evidence, perhaps, but she needed more. Returning to her room, Jane sat by the window, the snow now a thick curtain outside. The house creaked, its old bones settling in the cold. She thought of the guests, each with a motive, each with a secret. Victor's debts, Clara's wealth, Dr. Quill's knowledge, Mrs. Gray's gossip, Roger's forced cheer. They were pieces of a puzzle, and Jane was determined to fit them together. She opened her suitcase, took out her knitting, and began to work. The needles clicking like a clock, counting down to the truth. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new clues. The police might not arrive until the snow cleared, but Jane didn't need them yet. Her eyes, her ears, her understanding of people, these were her tools. As she knitted, she pictured the dining room, the pudding, the moment Clara fell. Someone had planned this, someone clever and cold. But Jane Marple was clever, too, in her quiet way, and she would not rest until the killer's mask was off. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Snow. The morning after Clara's death dawned cold and grey, with snow piling high against Winterbrook Hall's windows, sealing the grand house like a tomb. Miss Jane Marple woke early, her breath visible in the chilly air of her bedroom. The fire had died to embers, but her mind burned bright, turning over the events of the Christmas Eve feast. Clara's collapse, the bitter almond scent of cyanide, the untouched pudding plates, and that speck of white powder she tucked into her handkerchief. She dressed warmly, wrapping her grey shawl tight, and slipped the handkerchief into her pocket. Today she would dig deeper, her quiet steps and sharp eyes hunting for the truth. Downstairs, the house was hushed, the festive cheer of last night replaced by a heavy stillness. The dining room, where Clara had fallen, was untouched. The table, still set with half-eaten plates, and the plum pudding's remains. Jane paused by Clara's chair, her gaze lingering on the smeared brandy sauce, thicker than on the other plates. Someone had poured extra, she was sure, and that someone had known Clara would eat it. But how? And why only her? The questions buzzed like bees in her mind as she moved toward the hall. Lady Beatrice Harrowfield met her in the sitting-room, her face pale and her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "Jane, I barely slept," she whispered, her green eyes shadowed. "Clara's gone, and we're trapped here with whoever did this." Jane patted her friend's arm, her voice calm. "We'll find the truth, Beatrice. People always leave traces, like footprints in snow." Beatrice nodded, her trust in Jane a flicker of light in the gloom. She offered tea, but Jane asked to see the room where Clara's body lay, hoping for clues. The guest room was small, its heavy curtains drawn, casting the space in dim light. Clara's body rested on the bed, covered with a sheet, her face peaceful but pale as the snow outside. Beatrice unlocked the door with the key she'd kept, her hand trembling. Jane stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. The window was shut tight, no sign of tampering. A small table held Clara's purse, a silk scarf, and a silver locket Jane hadn't noticed before. She asked Beatrice's permission to look closer, and Beatrice nodded, her lips tight. Jane opened the purse, finding only a comb, a few coins, and a crumpled letter. The letter, in Clara's neat handwriting, was addressed to Victor, but unfinished, ending mid-sentence. "I know what you did in London, and I can't—" Jane's heart quickened. What had Victor done? She tucked the letter back, her mind filing it away. The locket was heavier than it looked, its clasp stiff. Inside was a tiny photograph of Clara's father, his stern face staring out. and a folded slip of paper, too small to read in the dim light. Jane slipped it into her handkerchief with the powder, knowing it might hold a secret worth killing for. As they left the room, Beatrice locked the door again, but Jane noticed the key's teeth were shiny, as if newly used. "Who else has access to this key?" she asked. Beatrice frowned. "Only me, and Mrs. Dobbs has a master key for the house." Jane nodded, her thoughts turning to the stern housekeeper. Mrs. Dobbs had been quick to clear the kitchen last night. Too quick, perhaps. Had she touched this room too? In the kitchen, Jane found Elsie, the young cook, scrubbing pots with fierce energy, her eyes red from crying. Mrs. Dobbs stood nearby, sorting linens, her face as hard as the stone floor. Jane smiled kindly at Elsie. "You've had a terrible shock, dear. Can you tell me about the pudding again?" Elsie sniffed, her hands pausing. "I made it like always, miss. Plums, sugar, flour, eggs. The brandy sauce was from the bottle, in the pantry. I didn't add nothing else." Jane nodded, her eyes on the pantry door, still locked. "And who poured the sauce last night?" she asked. Elsie hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Dobbs. "I did, miss, but Mrs. Dobbs served the pudding. She always does for big dinners." Mrs. Dobbs looked up, her gaze sharp. "I served it, yes, but I didn't touch the sauce. Elsie poured it before I took the tray out." Jane's smile didn't waver, but she noted the tension between them. Someone was lying, or at least not telling the full truth. She asked to see the pantry again, and Mrs. Dobbs unlocked it with a grunt, revealing the same tidy shelves and the brandy bottle now sealed with a cloth to preserve it for the police. Jane sniffed the bottle again, the bitter almond scent faint but unmistakable. She noticed a small jar of ground spices nearby, its lid slightly askew. "What's this?" she asked. Elsie peered over. "Cinnamon, miss, for the pudding." Jane opened it, finding the spice mixed with a few white grains, like the powder she'd found last night. She took a pinch, wrapping it in her handkerchief. "We'll keep this safe, too," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Dobbs's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Back in the sitting room, the guests gathered, their faces drawn. Victor sat by the fire, his hands clasped, his jaw tight. Dr. Quill paced near the window, his glasses fogging from the cold glass. Mrs. Gray perched on a sofa, her black dress stark against the cushions, her lips curled in a faint smirk. Roger, Tate tried to lighten the mood, offering to fetch more wood, but his cheer felt hollow. Jane sat quietly, her hands folded, watching them all. She sensed fear, but also secrets, each guest hiding something behind their eyes. Beatrice, trying to keep order, suggested a game of cards, but no one agreed. Instead, Victor spoke, his voice low. "Clara was scared," he said, staring into the fire. She didn't say why, but the last few days she was jumpy, kept looking over her shoulder. Jane tilted her head. Did she mention anyone? A letter, perhaps. Victor shook his head, but his fingers twitched, and Jane wondered if he knew about the unfinished letter in Clara's purse. Mrs. Gray's voice cut through the silence. Scared? Maybe she had reason. Her father's money made enemies, you know. Her eyes flicked to Roger, who flushed. "Nonsense," he said, his laugh forced. "Clara's father and I were old friends. Business rivals, sure. but no bad blood. Jane noted his quick defence, her mind recalling Beatrice's hint about Roger's past. Had he clashed with Clara's father over more than business? Quill stopped pacing, his sharp face thoughtful. "Cyanide's a cruel poison," he said almost to himself. "Fast, but not instant. Whoever used it knew what they were doing." Jane's eyes met his, and she saw a flicker of unease. "You know poisons well, Doctor?" she asked, her tone mild. He nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Part of my work. I study toxins, their effects. But I keep nothing dangerous here." His words were smooth, but Jane caught a slight tremor in his hand. A doctor's knowledge could be deadly, she thought. The conversation turned to the snow, still falling thickly, trapping them all. Tom, the driver, poked his head in, his cap dusted white. "No chance of police today, ma'am," he told Beatrice. "Roads are blocked solid." The guests murmured, their unease growing. Jane used the moment to slip away, heading to the conservatory, where she'd seen Clara linger yesterday. The glass-walled room was warm, filled with lush ferns and strange flowers, their petals bright against the snowy backdrop. Jane walked slowly, her eyes scanning the floor. Near a potted orchid, she found a tiny scrap of paper, torn and smudged, with the word formula scrawled in pencil. Her heart quickened. Clara's father, the chemist, had been famous for his discoveries. Had Clara carried one of his secrets, perhaps in that locket? Jane tucked the scrap into her handkerchief, her mind racing. A formula could mean wealth, power or danger, enough to kill for. She thought of Dr. Quill's interest in herbs, Mrs. Gray's pointed questions, Victor's debts. Each could want a secret like that, but who had acted? Returning to the sitting room, Jane found the guests arguing. Mrs. Gray accused Victor of knowing more than he let on, her voice sharp. "Clara was rich, and you're drowning in debt," she said. Victor's face reddened, and he stood, fists clenched. "Mind your tongue, Lavinia. I loved her." Roger stepped between them, his hands raised. "Enough. We're all shaken. No need to point fingers." But Jane saw his eyes dart to Victor, wary and quick. Beatrice, looking frail, asked Jane to join her in the library. The room was a haven of dark wood and leather books, a fire crackling in the grate. Beatrice sank into a chair, her voice low. "Clara came to me last week, Jane. She said she'd found something in her father's papers, something valuable. She wouldn't say what, but she was scared. Kept it in her locket, I think." Jane nodded, the pieces clicking like her knitting needles. The locket, the letter, the formula. Clara had been a target, but why now? Jane asked about the guests' movements before the feast. Beatrice recalled seeing Victor in the hall, arguing with Clara in hushed tones. Mrs. Gray had been in the conservatory, clipping a flower for her dress. Dr. Quill had been in his room, or so he said. Roger had been outside, checking the stables with Tom. Mrs. Dobbs and Elsie had been in the kitchen all day, but Elsie had stepped out briefly to fetch eggs from the henhouse. Jane filed each detail away, knowing timing was key. As they spoke, a loud crash echoed from the hall. Jane and Beatrice hurried out, finding a vase shattered on the marble floor. Elsie stood nearby, her face pale, a broom in hand. I bumped it, ma'am," she stammered. Mrs. Dobbs appeared, scolding her, but Jane's eyes were on the floor. Among the shards was a small key, not unlike the one to Clara's room. She bent down, pretending to adjust her shoe, and slipped it into her pocket. Had Elsie dropped it, or was it planted? Back in her room, Jane examined her finds: the white powder, the locket's paper, the formula scrap, and now the key. She tested the key in her own door, but it didn't fit. It was too small, perhaps for a drawer or a box. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a lost key had once led her to a stolen will. Here, the key might unlock more than a door. It might open the truth. The day wore on, the snow unrelenting. Jane sat by her window, watching the flakes fall, her mind weaving the clues. Clara's fear, Victor's anger, Dr. Quill's knowledge, Mrs. Gray's barbs, Roger's secrets, the servant's tension. They were threads in a tangled web. She took out her knitting, the needles clicking softly, each stitch a step towards unravelling the mystery. The house was quiet, but danger lingered, and Jane knew she must tread carefully to catch a killer before they struck again. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Secret. The morning was grey, the snow still falling, locking the house in a cold embrace. Jane dressed warmly, her grey shawl snug, and tucked the handkerchief into her sleeve. She needed to learn more about the guests and their secrets, but first she wanted to explore Dr. Ernest Quill's room. His talk of poisons and his nervous glances at the pudding made her curious. Could a doctor, trusted to heal, have the knowledge to kill? She slipped into the hall, her steps soft on the thick rugs, and headed to the guest wing. Dr. Quill's room was on the second floor, its door plain but sturdy. Jane knocked lightly, but no answer came. The house was quiet, the guests likely in their rooms or the sitting room, nursing their fears. She tried the small key from the vase, but it didn't fit the door. The lock looked solid, but Jane noticed the window beside it was unlatched, a thin layer of snow dusting the sill. Someone could have slipped in, she thought, her heart quickening. She pushed the window open, careful not to disturb the snow, and peered inside. The room was tidy. A narrow bed, a desk with papers, and a leather medical bag in the corner. She couldn't enter without being seen, so she closed the window and made a mental note to return later. Downstairs, the dining room remained untouched, a grim reminder of the feast. The plum pudding's remains sat on the table, its brandy sauce now a suspect in Clara's death. Jane paused by Clara's chair, picturing the extra sauce smeared on her plate. Someone had targeted her, but the how and why were still shadows. She found Lady Beatrice Harrowfield in the library, surrounded by shelves of old books, their leather spines gleaming in the firelight. Beatrice's face was drawn, her hands clutching a teacup. "Jane, I feel so helpless," she said. "Clara was so young, so frightened. I should have done more." Jane sat beside her, her voice gentle. "You couldn't know, Beatrice, but you can help me now. Tell me about Dr. Quill. He seems watchful." Beatrice sighed, setting her cup down. "Ernest is clever, too clever sometimes. He's been studying Clara's father's work. Chemicals, antidotes, things I don't understand. He keeps a locked bag for his experiments, but he swears it's safe." Jane nodded, her mind on the unlatched window. A locked bag meant little if someone could climb through. She asked Beatrice about the other guests' movements the night before the feast. Beatrice recalled Victor Harrowfield pacing the garden, his face stormy after a talk with Clara. Mrs. Lavinia Gray had been in the drawing room, writing letters, her pen scratching late into the night. Roger Tate had lingered in the billiard room, smoking a cigar, his laugh echoing. Mrs. Dobbs and Elsie had been in the kitchen, though Elsie had gone to the village briefly for fresh cream. Jane stored each detail, knowing timing could point to the killer. The sitting room was tense when Jane entered. Victor sat slumped, his dark eyes hollow, his hands gripping a glass of brandy. Mrs. Gray perched on an armchair, her black dress sharp against the soft cushions, her gaze flicking over everyone like a blade. Roger tried to joke about the snow, but his voice cracked, and no one smiled. Dr. Quill stood by a bookshelf, flipping through a journal, his fingers restless. Jane settled into a corner chair, her hands folded, watching their faces for tells. In St. Mary Mead, she'd once caught a thief by his nervous twitch. Here, every guest had one. Victor broke the silence, his voice rough. Clara didn't deserve this. She was scared of something, someone. I should have listened. His words hung heavy, and Jane wondered again about the unfinished letter in Clara's purse. I know what you did in London. Had Victor's debts pushed him too far? Mrs. Gray's lips curled. Scared? Maybe she knew too much. Her father's work wasn't all clean, you know. Her eyes slid to Dr. Quill, who stiffened but said nothing. Jane spoke softly, her tone disarming. Dr. Quill, you mentioned cyanide last night. How would someone get it? He adjusted his glasses, his voice steady but his eyes wary. It's not hard to find if you know where to look. Chemists' labs, even some plants. I have a small sample in my bag, locked of course, for study. Jane nodded, picturing the unlatched window. And your bag is secure? She asked. He nodded, too quickly. Always. The conversation shifted as Beatrice entered, suggesting they move Clara's belongings to a locked trunk for safekeeping. Jane offered to help, hoping to examine the locket's paper more closely. They returned to the guest room, Beatrice unlocking the door with her key. Inside, Clara's purse still sat on the table, the locket gleaming faintly. Jane opened it, unfolding the tiny paper. It was a list of numbers and letters. Chemical symbols, perhaps, but unclear. She memorized it, her mind racing. Was this the formula from the conservatory scrap? A recipe for wealth or death? As they packed Clara's scarf and comb, Jane noticed a faint scratch on the locket's back, like it had been pried open. Someone had wanted its contents, she thought. Beatrice, her voice trembling, said, Clara wore this always. She said it was her father's last gift. Jane nodded, her thoughts on the formula. If it was valuable, it could explain the murder. But whose hand had poured the poison? They locked the trunk and returned to the hall, where Mrs. Dobbs was, sweeping the marble floor, her face stern. Jane asked her about the pantry key, hoping to trace the cyanide's path. Only I have it, Mrs. Dobbs said, her hand patting her apron. No one else. But Jane remembered the small key in her handkerchief. It didn't fit the pantry or the guest room, perhaps a desk or a box. She needed to find its lock. Lunch was a quiet affair, the guests picking at cold meat and bread. Roger tried to talk of his travels, but his stories felt forced, his eyes darting to Victor. Mrs. Gray whispered to Beatrice, her words sharp. Clara's money wasn't all hers. You know, her father owed debts, dangerous ones. Jane's ears pricked up. Debts could mean enemies, and enemies could mean murder. She thought of Roger's business ties to Clara's father. Had an old grudge followed her here? After lunch, Jane slipped to the billiard room, where Roger had been the night before. The air smelled of cigar smoke, and a small table held an ashtray with a stub still warm. Under it she found a folded note, its edges worn. It read, "Meet me at midnight. We settle this." No signature, but the handwriting was bold, like Roger's. Jane tucked it into her handkerchief, her mind turning. Had Roger met Clara? Was this about her father's debts? She moved to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Gray had written letters. A wastebasket held torn paper, and Jane pieced together a fragment. Must know the truth about the formula. The rest was gone, but Jane's pulse quickened. Mrs. Gray was digging, but for what? Blackmail? Greed? Jane recalled her sharp comments, her watchful eyes. A widow with a taste for secrets could be dangerous. Jane then visited the garden, bundled in her shawl against the biting cold. The snow was deep, but a path led to a small shed near the greenhouse. The door was locked, and Jane tried the small key. It turned with a click, revealing shelves of gardening tools and a box of rat poison, its label faded but clear. Contains cyanide. Her breath caught. Here was the source, hidden but not far. Had someone slipped in, taken a pinch, and mixed it with the brandy sauce? The shed's lock was old, easily picked by someone clever. Back inside, Jane found Elsie in the servants' quarters, mending a torn apron. "Elsie, did anyone come to the kitchen yesterday?" Jane asked gently. Elsie's eyes widened. "Just the usual, Mrs. Dobbs, Tom, and Mr. Tate asking for a glass of water." Jane nodded, picturing Roger in the kitchen near the pantry. Had he lingered too long? That afternoon, Jane spoke with Tom, the driver, in the stables. His ruddy cheeks flushed as he brushed a horse. "Did you see anyone near the shed yesterday?" she asked. He shook his head, but his eyes flickered. "Just Mr. Victor, walking the garden, looked upset." Jane thanked him, her mind on Victor's argument with Clara. Had he gone to the shed, seeking poison for his debts? In the library, Jane found Dr. Quill alone, reading a book on toxicology. She sat nearby, her voice soft. "Your studies must be fascinating, Doctor. Ever work with Clara's father?" He closed the book, his fingers tight. "Briefly. He was brilliant, worked on antidotes, never shared his best work, though." Jane nodded, thinking of the locket's paper. If it held an antidote formula, Quill might kill to claim it. As evening fell, the house grew colder, the snow unrelenting. Jane sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking, her mind weaving the clues. The rat poison, the locket's formula, Roger's note, Mrs. Gray's letter, Victor's anger. Each guest had a motive, each a chance to strike. She thought of a village scandal in St. Mary Mead, where a hidden letter had revealed a killer. Here the truth was close, but the web was tight. Jane's eyes gleamed, her resolve firm. The killer was in this house, and she would find them before the snow melted. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Walls. The snow outside Winterbrook Hall fell in thick curtains, wrapping the grand estate in a silent, icy grip. Miss Jane Marple stood in the dim hallway, her grey shawl snug against the morning chill, her mind buzzing with the clues she'd gathered. The white powder from the kitchen, the tiny paper from Clara's locket, the torn scrap with formula scrawled on it, the small key from the broken vase, and the rat poison in the garden shed. Each was a piece of the puzzle that led to Clara Merton's death, and Jane's sharp eyes were determined to fit them together. The house was quiet, but the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Jane's first task was to explore the servants' quarters, where Mrs. Dobbs, the stern housekeeper, and Elsie, the young cook, spent much of their time. She suspected one of them knew more about the poisoned brandy sauce than they'd let on. Slipping down a narrow staircase, she reached the lower level, where the air smelled of soap and damp stone. The servants' hall was modest, with a long table, a few chairs, and a small fire crackling in the grate. Elsie sat alone, peeling potatoes, her hands steady, but her eyes red from crying. Jane smiled kindly, her voice soft. "You're working hard, Elsie. Mind if I sit a moment?" Elsie nodded, her knife pausing. Jane settled into a chair, her hands folded, watching the girl's face. "It must be hard with all this trouble," Jane said. "Did you notice anything odd in the kitchen before the feast?" Elsie's eyes flicked to the door, as if checking for Mrs. Dobbs. "Nothing, miss. I made the pudding like always, but—" She hesitated, her voice dropping. "I saw someone in the pantry that morning. Couldn't tell who, just a shadow, through the crack in the door." Jane's heart quickened. "Before or after you poured the brandy sauce?" she asked. "Before," Elsie said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought it was Mrs. Dobbs, but she was upstairs." Jane nodded, her mind racing. Someone had been in the pantry, where the brandy bottle held the faint almond scent of cyanide. Was it the same person who'd taken the rat poison from the shed? She thanked Elsie and rose, her eyes catching a small wooden box under the table, its lid carved with a simple flower. She tried the small key from her handkerchief, but it didn't fit. Still, she noted the box, wondering if it held something worth hiding. Upstairs, the guests were gathered in the drawing room, their faces tense under the weight of Clara's death. Victor Harrowfield stood by a window, staring at the snow, his hands clenched. Mrs. Lavinia Gray sat with a book, her sharp eyes darting over the pages, though Jane doubted she was reading. Roger Tate paced near the fireplace, his usual cheer replaced by a nervous energy. Dr. Ernest Quill was absent, and Jane wondered if he was in his room, guarding his medical bag, or hiding something else. Lady Beatrice Harrowfield entered, her silver hair slightly untidy, her voice strained. "Jane, the police won't come until the snow stops. We're on our own." Jane nodded, her calm gaze steadying Beatrice. "We'll manage, dear. May I speak with Mrs. Dobbs? I'd like to know more about the kitchen routine." Beatrice sent for the housekeeper, who arrived with her usual stern frown, her apron crisp despite the chaos. Jane asked about the pantry, keeping her tone light. "Who else went in there the day of the feast, Mrs. Dobbs? Besides you and Elsie?" The housekeeper's eyes narrowed. "No one, Miss Marple. I keep it locked always." but Jane caught a slight twitch in her jaw, a sign of unease. "And the brandy bottle?" Jane pressed. "Did you check it before Elsie used it?" Mrs. Dobbs hesitated, then said, "It was fine. Same bottle we've used for years." Jane thanked her, but her mind was on Elsie's story of the shadow in the pantry. Mrs. Dobbs was hiding something, or protecting someone. Jane decided to visit the pantry again, but first she wanted to see Victor. His grief seemed real, but the letter in Clara's purse, "I know what you did in London," suggested secrets. She found him in the billiard room, chalking a cue, his movements sharp and restless. "Mr. Harrowfield," Jane said, her voice gentle. "Clara seemed troubled before the feast. Did she share anything with you?" Victor's hand froze, the chalk crumbling slightly. "She was nervous," he said, his voice low. "Kept saying someone was watching her. I thought it was just wedding jitters." His eyes met Jane's, and she saw a flicker of fear. "Did she mention her father's work?" Jane asked. Victor shook his head, but his fingers tightened on the cue. "She didn't talk about him much. Just said his papers were important." Jane nodded, thinking of the locket's paper and the formula scrap. Had Victor known what Clara carried? Jane left the billiard room. She heard raised voices from the drawing room. Mrs. Gray was speaking, her tone sharp as a knife. "Victor's debts are no secret. Clara's money was his way out, and now she's gone. Convenient, isn't it?" Roger's voice boomed in reply. "That's cruel, Lavinia. The boy's heartbroken." Jane slipped into the room, her presence unnoticed, and saw Victor storm in, his face red. "You've got no right," he snapped at Mrs. Gray. "Clara loved me, and I'd never hurt her." Mrs. Gray smirked, unruffled. "Love doesn't pay bills, dear." Jane watched the exchange, noting Roger's quick defence of Victor. Was he truly kind, or covering his own tracks? She recalled the note under the ashtray, "Meet me at midnight," and wondered if Roger had met Clara, perhaps to settle an old score with her father. She decided to check the stables, where Roger had been before the feast. The path outside was treacherous, the snow deep, but Jane bundled up and trudged through, her boots crunching. The stables were warm, smelling of hay and horses. Tom, the driver, was mucking a stall, his face surprised to see her. "Miss Marple, it's bitter out. What brings you here?" "Just stretching my legs," Jane said, her smile disarming. "You were here with Mr. Tate before the feast, yes?" Tom nodded, his cheeks flushing. "Aye, he was checking on his horse. Stayed a bit, chatting about India." Jane's eyes scanned the stable, landing on a small bucket near the door, filled with grain. A faint white dust clung to its rim, like the powder she'd found in the kitchen. "What's this?" she asked, pointing. Tom shrugged. "Just grain, miss, for the horses." Jane took a pinch, wrapping it in her handkerchief. It felt gritty, like the kitchen powder and the shed's rat poison. Back inside, Jane found Dr. Quill in the library, his nose in a thick book on chemistry. She sat nearby, her voice soft. "You studied with Clara's father, didn't you?" Quill looked up, his glasses glinting. "Years ago. He was working on something big. An antidote, he said. Never finished it." Jane nodded, thinking of the locket's paper. Did Clara know about it? Quill's fingers twitched. She might have. She had his papers. His voice was calm, but Jane saw his eyes dart to the door, as if expecting someone. Jane decided to test the small key. again this time in the library. A small desk in the corner had a locked drawer, and the key fit perfectly, turning with a soft click. Inside was a single page, torn from a notebook, with chemical symbols and a sketch of a vial. At the bottom was Clara's name, written in her neat hand. Jane's pulse raced. This was no coincidence. The formula was real, and someone wanted it badly enough to kill. She tucked the page into her handkerchief, locking the drawer again. Lunch was tense, the guests barely speaking. Beatrice tried to keep the peace, offering soup and bread, but the air was thick with suspicion. Mrs. Gray's eyes followed Victor, who ate nothing, his hands shaking. Roger talked of the weather, his voice too loud, while Dr. Quill stared at his plate, lost in thought. Jane watched them all, her mind on the formula page. Was it the antidote Quill mentioned? And who had hidden it in the desk? After lunch, Jane slipped to the conservatory, where Mrs. Gray had been seen clipping flowers. The glass walls were steamed, the air heavy with the scent of earth and blooms. Near a rosebush, Jane found a torn glove, its leather worn but fine. Inside was a smudge of white powder, like the grains in the stable and kitchen. She wrapped it in her handkerchief, her mind racing. The glove was small, perhaps a woman's, Mrs. Gray's, or Clara's left behind. Jane returned to the drawing room, where Beatrice was speaking with Mrs. Dobbs. The housekeeper's face was tight, her hands smoothing her apron. Jane asked about the servants' routines, hoping to trace the pantry shadow Elsie saw. Did anyone else come to the kitchen that morning? She asked. Mrs. Dobbs shook her head, but her eyes flicked away. Just us, miss. Busy day with the feast. Jane nodded, sensing another lie. She recalled Elsie's wooden box. Could it hold answers? That evening Jane visited Elsie again, finding her in the servants' hall, sewing by lamplight. "Elsie, that box under the table, yours?" Jane asked. Elsie's needle paused, her face pale. "Yes, miss, just keepsakes." Jane smiled, her tone gentle. "May I see?" Elsie hesitated, then pulled out the box. The small key fit, opening it to reveal a locket like Clara's, but empty, and a letter addressed to Elsie's mother. "Clara gave me this," Elsie said, touching the locket. "Said it was for luck." Jane's heart skipped. 2 lockets? Or a decoy? As night fell, Jane sat by her window, the snow glowing under a faint moon. Her handkerchief held a growing collection: powder, papers, a glove, a key. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a misplaced glove had once led to a thief. Here, the glove and powder pointed to a killer. But who? Victor's debts, Quill's knowledge, Mrs. Gray's barbs, Roger's note, Elsie's locket. They were threads in a deadly knot. Jane took out her knitting, the needles clicking like a clock, each stitch a step toward truth. The house creaked, and somewhere a door closed softly. Jane's eyes narrowed. The killer was close, and she would not rest until they were caught. Chapter 6. The Hidden Door. The snow outside Winterbrook Hall fell relentlessly, piling against the windows like a wall, trapping the guests and servants in a house heavy with secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, her grey shawl draped over, her shoulders, her knitting needles still for once as she studied the treasures in her handkerchief. A speck of white powder from the kitchen, a tiny paper from Clara's locket with chemical symbols, a torn scrap with formula, scrawled on it a small key from a broken vase, a page of chemical notes from a locked desk, and a torn glove with a powdery smudge. Each clue was a stitch in the fabric of Clara Merton's murder, and Jane's sharp mind was weaving them together, determined to uncover the killer before the snow melted. The morning was bitter, the air in the grand house sharp with cold and fear. Jane tucked her handkerchief into her sleeve and headed downstairs, her steps soft on the polished wood. She wanted to explore the upper floors, where the guests' rooms held secrets of their own. Clara's death was no accident. Someone had slipped cyanide into the brandy sauce, targeting her alone. But why? The formula, Jane suspected, was the key, tied to Clara's father's work as a chemist. She needed to learn more about the guests' connections to him, starting with Roger Tate, whose note, "Meet me at midnight," hinted at a hidden meeting. Jane reached the guest wing, where a long hallway stretched, its walls lined with old portraits whose eyes seemed to watch her. Roger's room was at the far end, its door slightly ajar. She knocked softly, but no answer came. Peering inside, she saw a cluttered space, a suitcase open on the bed, papers scattered on a desk, and a faint smell of cigar smoke. A small wooden box caught her eye, its lid carved with a ship, like the one in Elsie's quarters. Jane tried the small key from her handkerchief, and it turned with a click, revealing a bundle of letters tied with string. The top one was addressed to Roger in a bold hand. "You'll pay for what you took." No signature, but the paper matched the midnight note. Jane's heart quickened. Had Roger argued with Clara over her father's business? She tucked the letter back, careful to leave no trace, and slipped out. As she turned, she nearly bumped into Mrs. Lavinia Gray, whose sharp eyes narrowed. "Snooping, Miss Marple?" she said, her voice like a blade. Jane smiled unruffled. "Just admiring the portraits, Mrs. Gray. Such history in these walls." Mrs. Gray's lips twitched, but she said nothing, gliding past with a rustle of black silk. Jane watched her go, noting the way her hand clutched her purse, as if guarding something precious. Did Mrs. Gray know about the formula too? In the drawing-room, the guests were gathered, their faces drawn. Victor Harrowfield sat by the fire, his hands twisting a handkerchief, his eyes dark with grief or guilt. Dr. Ernest Quill stood near, a window, his glasses fogging as he stared at the snow. Roger tried to lighten the mood, offering a story about a Christmas in India, but his laugh was hollow. Lady Beatrice Harrowfield entered, her silver hair neat, but her hands trembling as she poured tea. "Jane, any news?" she whispered, her voice low. Jane shook her head, her eyes on the guests. "Not yet, dear, but we're getting closer." Jane decided to speak with Roger, hoping to learn about his note. She found him in the billiard room, rolling a cue ball across the green felt. "Mr. Tate," she said, her tone gentle, "you knew Clara's father, didn't you?" Roger's hand paused, the ball clicking against another. "Met him years ago," he said, his voice too casual. "Business dealings, nothing special." Jane tilted her head. "But you saw Clara the night before the feast, didn't you? Near the stables." Roger's eyes flickered, but he grinned. "Just a chat, Miss Marple. She was worried about Victor's debts." Jane nodded, filing away his lie. The note suggested more than a chat. She left Roger and headed to the library, where she'd found the chemical page in the locked desk. The room was quiet, its shelves towering with old books, their leather spines gleaming. Jane sat at the desk, her fingers tracing its edge. A faint scratch mark caught her eye, near the drawer, as if someone had pried it open before she'd used the key. Had someone else been searching for the formula? She opened the drawer again, finding only dust, but noticed a loose panel in the desk's back. Pressing it, she heard a soft click, and a hidden compartment slid open, revealing a small vial of clear liquid labelled Sample A. Jane's breath caught. Was this connected to the cyanide, or the antidote Clara's father had worked on? She wrapped the vial in her handkerchief, her mind racing. The library was a treasure trove, but dangerous. She needed to talk to Dr. Quill, whose knowledge of poisons made him a suspect. She found him in the conservatory, tending a potted herb with delicate leaves. "Dr. Quill," she said, her voice soft, "you studied antidotes with Clara's father, yes?" He nodded, his fingers pausing on the plant. He was close to a breakthrough, a cyanide antidote. Never finished it, though. Jane watched, his face noting a flicker of excitement. "Did you ever see his notes?" she asked. Quill shook his head too quickly. No, but Clara might have. She was cagey about it. Jane thanked him and left, her thoughts on the vial. Was it the antidote or something deadly? She needed to test the small key again, suspecting it opened more than Roger's box. The hallway. She passed a narrow door she hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a tapestry. The key fit, opening to a dusty staircase that spiraled upward. Jane climbed carefully, her shawl catching on rough stone. The stairs led to a small attic room, its air cold and stale. Inside were old trunks, a cracked mirror, and a desk with a locked drawer. The key worked again, revealing a single letter in Clara's handwriting. "If I die, look to the one who knows my father's secret." Jane's pulse raced. Clara had known danger was near, and this letter was her warning. But who knew the secret? Quill, with his studies? Roger, with his past? Or someone else? She tucked the letter into her handkerchief, her mind buzzing. The attic was a find, but she couldn't linger. Someone might notice her absence. As she descended, she heard a creak below, like a footstep on the main stairs. She paused, her heart steady, and slipped back behind the tapestry, unseen. In the dining room, Jane joined Beatrice for tea, sharing the attic letter in a whisper. Beatrice's eyes widened. "Clara knew something," she said. "Her father's work was dangerous. People wanted it." Jane nodded, thinking of the vial and the formula. "We must keep this quiet," she said. "The killer's still here." Beatrice agreed, her face pale but firm. Lunch was grim, the guests barely eating. Mrs. Gray's sharp tongue struck again, hinting at Victor's debts. "Clara's money would have saved you, wouldn't it?" she said, her eyes glinting. Victor slammed his fist on the table, his voice raw. "Stop it, Lavinia. I'd give anything to have her back." Jane watched his anger, wondering if it hid guilt. Roger stayed quiet, his eyes on his plate, while Dr. Quill picked at his food, his thoughts elsewhere. Jane decided to visit the kitchen again, hoping to learn more about the shadow Elsie saw. Mrs. Dobbs was there, polishing silver, her face stern. "Mrs. Dobbs," Jane said, "did you lock the pantry right after Elsie poured the sauce?" The housekeeper nodded, her hands steady. "Always do." No one got in. But Jane recalled Elsie's story of the shadow. Someone had been there, and Mrs. Dobbs's calm felt forced. Jane asked to see Elsie, who was in the servants' hall, folding linens. "Elsie, that locket you showed me, when did Clara give it to you?" Elsie's fingers paused. "A week ago, miss. Said it was a thank you for helping her." Jane nodded, picturing the two lockets. Was Elsie's a decoy, meant to throw off a thief? She asked about the pantry shadow again, and Elsie's voice dropped. "I didn't tell Mrs. Dobbs, but I heard a man's voice, low, angry, couldn't make out the words." Jane thanked her and returned to the main house, her mind on the man's voice. Victor? Roger? Quill? She needed to check the shed again, where the rat poison was kept. Bundling up, she braved the snow, her boots sinking deep. The shed's lock was still intact, but a small window was cracked open, snow dusting the sill. Inside, the rat poison box was untouched, but a shovel leaned against the wall, its blade smudged with white powder. Jane wrapped a sample in her handkerchief. Her thoughts on the stable's grain bucket and the kitchen's cinnamon jar. The powder was everywhere, but who had spread it? Back inside, Jane found Tom in the hall, carrying firewood. "Tom, did you see anyone near the shed before the feast?" she asked. He shook his head, but his eyes darted away. "Just Mr. Victor, like I said. He was upset, pacing." Jane nodded, sensing Tom knew more. She'd ask again later, when he was less guarded. As evening fell, Jane sat in the library, the fire casting shadows on the walls. She took out her handkerchief, studying the clues. The powder, the locket's paper, the formula scrap, the desk, page, the glove, the vial, the attic letter, the shovel's smudge. Each pointed to a killer, but the web was tangled. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a hidden letter had once revealed a blackmailer. Here, Clara's letter was a cry from beyond, and Jane would answer it. Her knitting needles clicked softly, each stitch a step toward truth. The house was silent, but a faint tap echoed, like a finger on glass. Jane's eyes narrowed. The killer was watching, and she was ready to meet their gaze. Chapter 7. Footprints in the Dark. The snow outside Winterbrook Hall fell in heavy drifts, sealing the grand estate in a cocoon of white, as if the world beyond had vanished. Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire in her bedroom, her grey shawl snug against the evening chill, her knitting needles silent as she studied the growing collection in her handkerchief. White powder from the kitchen, a locket paper with chemical symbols, a torn scrap with formula, a small key from a broken vase, a chemical page from a locked desk, a torn glove with powder, a vial of clear liquid labelled Sample A, a letter from Clara warning of her father's secret, and a powdery smudge from a shed shovel. Each clue was a thread in the deadly web of Clara Merton's murder, and Jane's sharp mind was determined to untangle it before the killer struck again. The house was quiet, its halls dim with flickering lamplight, but Jane felt the weight of unseen eyes. The faint tap she'd heard last night, like a finger on glass, lingered in her thoughts. Someone was watching, moving in the shadows of Winterbrook Hall. She tucked her handkerchief into her sleeve and slipped into the corridor, her steps soft on the thick rugs. Tonight she would explore the upper floors again, seeking the source of that tap and any trace of the killer's path. The guest wing was silent, the portraits on the walls staring down like silent judges. Jane paused by Dr. Ernest Quill's room, remembering the unlatched window and his talk of poisons. She tried the small key in his door, but it didn't fit. Instead, she noticed a faint scuff on the floor, like a boot had dragged through dust. Following it, she found a narrow door hidden behind a heavy curtain, its frame almost invisible in the wall. The key turned smoothly, revealing a tight staircase winding down to the servants' quarters. Jane's heart quickened. A secret passage could explain the pantry shadow Elsie had seen, or the tap in the night. She descended carefully, her hand on the cold stone wall, the air growing damp and musty. The stairs opened into a small alcove near the kitchen, hidden behind a wooden panel. Jane pressed her ear to it, hearing the clink of dishes and Mrs. Dobbs's sharp voice scolding Elsie. "Mind the plates, girl. We can't have more mess." Jane waited until the sounds faded, then pushed the panel, which slid open silently. She stepped into the kitchen, now dark except for a single lamp. The pantry door was locked, but Jane tried the small key. It didn't fit, but she noticed a faint scratch on the lock, as if someone had tried to pick it. Jane moved to the counter where the pudding's remains had been. The dish was gone, likely stored by Mrs. Dobbs, but a small cloth lay nearby, stained with a sticky residue. She sniffed it, catching the bitter almond scent of cyanide mixed with brandy. Wrapping it in her handkerchief, she added it to her clues. The cloth suggested someone had wiped the poison into the sauce, perhaps in a hurry. But who had been in the kitchen unseen? She slipped back through the panel, returning to the main hall, her mind on the secret passage. It connected the guest wing to the kitchen, a perfect route for a killer to move unnoticed. She decided to speak with Lady Beatrice Harrowfield, hoping to learn more about the house's hidden corners. Beatrice was in the sitting room, her silver hair glowing in the firelight, her hands twisting a laced scarf. "Jane, this house feels cursed," she whispered. "I keep thinking of Clara, so frightened." Jane sat beside her, her voice gentle. "Beatrice, are there other hidden passages here? I found one to the kitchen." Beatrice's eyes widened. "I'd forgotten. Henry, my husband, showed me years ago. There's one from the guest wing to the servants' quarters, and another to the attic. Old houses like this are full of secrets." Jane nodded, picturing a killer slipping through the walls, silent as a ghost. "Who knows about them?" she asked. Beatrice frowned. "The staff, perhaps. Mrs. Dobbs has been here longest, and Victor, he played here as a boy." Jane's thoughts turned to Victor Harrowfield, whose debts and Clara's letter, "I know what you did in London," made him a suspect. She found him in the drawing-room, staring at a portrait of his uncle, Sir Henry. His face was pale, his hands clenched. "Mr. Harrowfield," Jane said, her tone soft, "you know this house well, don't you? Its hidden places." Victor started, his eyes wary. "I used to explore as a kid. Why?" Jane smiled. "Just curious. Did Clara ever mention hidden rooms?" He shook his head, but his fingers twitched, and Jane sensed he was holding back. She left him and headed to the attic, using the secret passage Beatrice described. The stairs were steep, the air thick with dust. The attic room was as she'd left it, with trunks and a cracked mirror, but something felt different. The desk where she'd found Clara's letter was slightly askew, as if moved. Jane knelt, spotting a faint footprint in the dust, too large for her own. Someone had been here, perhaps searching for the letter she'd taken. She checked the trunks, finding one unlocked, its lid heavy with age. Inside were old journals, their pages yellowed. One, in a neat hand, was signed by Clara's father, detailing experiments with cyanide antidotes. A single line stood out. "The formula is safe, hidden where only my daughter knows." Jane's pulse raced. Clara's locket was the key, but someone else was hunting it. She tucked the journal under her shawl, knowing it was too dangerous to leave behind. As she descended, she heard voices from the drawing room, sharp and heated. Mrs. Lavinia Gray was speaking, her voice like a whip. "Victor, you can't fool us. Clara's money was your only hope, and now she's dead." Victor's reply was a growl. "You're a vulture, Lavinia, always pecking at others' pain." Jane slipped in unnoticed and saw Roger Tate trying to calm them, his face flushed. "Enough, both of you. We're all trapped here. Let's not make it worse." But his eyes darted to the door, as if he wanted to flee. Jane sat quietly, her hands folded, watching their faces. Mrs. Gray's smirk hid a calculating mind, and Jane recalled the torn letter in the drawing-room wastebasket. Must know the truth about the formula. Was Mrs. Gray after Clara's secret too? Roger's quick defence of Victor felt forced, and Jane thought of the note in his room. "You'll pay for what you took." Had he stolen from Clara's father, or something more? Dr. Ernest Quill entered, his glasses glinting, his hands clutching a small notebook. Jane's eyes narrowed, remembering the vial in the desk. "Dr. Quill," she said, her tone mild, "you've been reading about antidotes. Did Clara ever share her father's notes with you?" Quill's fingers tightened on the notebook. "No, but she hinted at them, said they were private." His voice was steady, but Jane caught a flicker of unease. A doctor with poison knowledge was dangerous, especially one so curious. Lunch was a strained affair, the guests picking at cold ham and cheese. Beatrice tried to keep the peace, but the air crackled with tension. Mrs. Gray's eyes followed Victor, who ate nothing, his face a mask of anger. Roger talked of his travels, but his stories fell flat, his hands restless. Dr. Quill stared at his plate, lost in thought, while Jane watched them all, her mind on the journal and the secret passage. Someone had used it to reach the kitchen, she was sure, and the footprint in the attic suggested they were still searching. After lunch, Jane returned to the kitchen, hoping to catch Mrs. Dobbs off guard. The housekeeper was scrubbing a pot, her face stern as ever. "Mrs. Dobbs," Jane said, "you've worked here a long time. Know any hidden passages?" The housekeeper's hands paused, her eyes sharp. "Old houses have their quirks, miss, but I stick to the main halls." Jane smiled, sensing a dodge. "And the pantry? Anyone asked to use it before the feast?" Mrs. Dobbs shook her head, but her fingers gripped the pot tightly. Jane filed it away, knowing the housekeeper was hiding something. She found Elsie in the servants' hall, mending a tablecloth. "Elsie, that man's voice you heard in the pantry. Any guess who it was?" Jane asked. Elsie's needle stopped, her face pale. "I couldn't say, miss. Sounded deep like Mr. Tate or Mr. Victor, but I didn't see." Jane nodded, thinking of Roger's visit to the kitchen for water and Victor's pacing in the garden. Either could have slipped through the passage. Jane decided to check the garden shed again, braving the snow once more. The path was nearly buried, but she reached the shed, its window still cracked open. Inside, the rat poison box was untouched, but a small cloth bag lay in the corner, half hidden under straw. Jane opened it, finding a glass dropper with a faint white residue. She wrapped it in her handkerchief, her mind racing. The dropper could have carried the cyanide to the brandy sauce, precise and deadly. Had the killer left it behind in a rush? Back inside, Jane visited the stables, where Tom was brushing a horse. "Tom," she said, "did you see anyone near the shed besides Victor?" He hesitated, his cheeks red. "I might have seen Mr. Tate, miss. Early, before the feast. He said he was checking tools." Jane thanked him, her thoughts on Roger's lies. He'd been everywhere, the stables, the kitchen, the shed. Was he the shadow in the pantry? As evening fell, Jane sat in the library, the fire casting long shadows. She opened the journal from the attic, reading more of Clara's father's notes. The antidote was real, a mix of chemicals that could neutralize cyanide. Clara had known where it was hidden, and someone had killed her for it. Jane's handkerchief held the clues, but the dropper and the passage were new threads, pointing to a careful plan. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a hidden path had once led to a stolen jewel. Here the path led to murder, and Jane was close to the truth. Her knitting needles clicked softly, each stitch a step forward. The house creaked, and a faint tap echoed again, closer now, like a footstep in the dark. Jane's eyes gleamed. The killer was moving, but so was she, and the net was tightening around them. Chapter 8. The Candles Flicker. The snow outside Winterbrook Hall clung to the windows like a shroud, locking the grand estate in a frozen prison. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, the fire casting a warm glow on her grey shawl, her knitting, needles still as she studied the clues tucked in her handkerchief. White powder from the kitchen, a locket paper with chemical symbols, a torn scrap with formula, a small key from a broken vase, a chemical page from a locked desk, a torn glove with powder, a vial labelled Sample A, a letter from Clara warning of her father's secret, a powdery smudge from a shed shovel, a stained cloth from the kitchen, and a glass dropper from the shed. Each was a piece of the puzzle that led to Clara Merton's murder, and Jane's sharp mind was weaving them into a net to catch a killer. The evening was cold, the house quiet except for the creak of old wood and the faint tap she'd heard before. Like a restless finger on glass, Jane felt the killer moving closer, their steps hidden in the shadows of the sprawling manor. She tucked her handkerchief into her sleeve and slipped into the hallway, her boots soft on the thick rugs. Tonight she would search the drawing room, where Mrs. Lavinia Gray had been writing letters, hoping to find more traces of the formula or the killer's intent. The drawing room was dim, lit only by a single candle on a table, its flame flickering in the draught. Jane's eyes scanned the space. Plush chairs, a writing desk, and a tall bookcase filled with novels and old ledgers. She moved to the desk, where she'd found the torn letter fragment about the formula. The wastebasket was empty now, but a faint ink smudge on the desk's edge caught her attention. She ran her finger over it, finding it still tacky, as if someone had written recently. Under the desk, she spotted a crumpled paper, half hidden by a chair leg. It was a note in a sharp, slanted hand. "The formula is worth more than you know. Meet me in the conservatory midnight." No signature, but the ink matched Mrs. Gray's pen. Jane's heart quickened. Mrs. Gray was digging for Clara's secret, perhaps to sell it or use it. She tucked the note into her handkerchief, her mind racing. Had Mrs. Gray met someone in the conservatory, plotting to steal the formula? Or was she the target? Jane decided to check the conservatory next, but first she wanted to speak with Lady Beatrice Harrowfield about the house's history. Old estates like this often hid more than passages. They held grudges and debts. Beatrice was in the library, her silver hair catching the firelight, her hands clutching a book she wasn't reading. "Jane, I feel the walls closing in," she said, her voice trembling. "This house, it's full of ghosts." Jane sat beside her, her tone gentle. "Beatrice, tell me about Clara's father. Did he have enemies here?" Beatrice's eyes clouded. "He was a chemist, brilliant but secretive. He worked with Roger Tate years ago, until they fought over a patent. Roger lost everything nearly. And Dr. Quill, he studied with Clara's father, always asking about his work. Then there's Victor, who borrowed from Clara's father and never repaid." Jane nodded, the web tightening. Roger's grudge, Quill's curiosity, Victor's debts, each could lead to murder. Jane asked about the conservatory, where Mrs. Gray's note suggested a meeting. "It's Clara's favourite place," Beatrice said. "She'd sit there for hours, reading her father's letters." Jane thanked her and headed to the conservatory, her shawl tight against the chill. The glass walls were fogged, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and roses. Moonlight filtered through, casting shadows of twisting vines. Jane moved carefully, her eyes scanning the floor. Near a bench, she found a crushed petal, its red stalk against the stone. Beside it was a tiny button, black and shiny, like one from Mrs. Gray's dress. Jane wrapped it in her handkerchief, picturing a struggle or a hurried meeting. As she turned to leave, a soft creak came from the far end of the room. Jane froze, her heart steady but alert. A shadow moved behind a fern, then vanished. She stepped closer, her boots silent, and found a small door hidden by leaves, its hinges rusty. The small key from her handkerchief fit, opening to a narrow passage that smelled of mildew. Jane hesitated, then stepped inside, her hand on the wall. The passage led to the basement, where old crates and barrels loomed in the dark. A faint light flickered ahead, and Jane crept forward, her breath shallow. The light came from a lantern on a crate beside a small notebook. Jane opened it, finding pages of chemical equations, each signed with Clara's father's initials. A loose page read, "The antidote must stay hidden. Trust only C." Jane's pulse raced. This was the formula, or part of it, hidden where Clara could find it. Had someone else found it too? She tucked the notebook into her shawl, extinguishing the lantern. As she turned, a board creaked behind her, and she slipped behind a barrel, her heart calm but her senses sharp. Footsteps retreated, heavy and quick, up the passage. Jane returned to the main house, her mind on the shadow. Was it the killer, checking their hiding place? She needed to talk to Victor, whose debts and connection to Clara's father made him a suspect. She found him in the billiard room, racking balls with a restless energy. "Mr. Harrowfield," she said, her voice soft. "Clara was scared before she died. Did she mention her father's enemies?" Victor's hand paused, the cue trembling. She said someone was after her, but she wouldn't name them. Kept touching her locket like it was a shield. Jane nodded, thinking of the lockets. Paper. "Did you ever borrow from her father?" she asked. Victor's eyes darkened. "Once. He forgave it. Old history." But his voice was tight, and Jane sensed a lie. She left him and sought Dr. Quill, hoping to learn more about the antidote. He was in his room, the door open, his medical bag on the desk. Jane knocked, her smile disarming. "Dr. Quill, you knew Clara's father's work. Was his antidote valuable?" Quill's glasses glinted as he turned. "Priceless if it worked. It could save lives or make a fortune." His fingers brushed the bag, and Jane noticed a small lock, too large for her key. "Did you ever see it?" she asked. He shook his head, but his eyes darted to the bag, and Jane wondered what he hid. Lunch was a grim affair. The guests gathered in the dining room, where Clara's death still lingered. Mrs. Gray's sharp tongue struck again, hinting at Roger's past. "Your business with Clara's father wasn't clean, was it?" she said, her smirk cold. Roger's face reddened. "Old rumours, Lavinia. Let it go." Victor stayed silent, his hands clenched, while Beatrice tried to steer the talk to the weather. Jane watched them all, her mind on the conservatory button and the basement notebook. Someone was hunting the antidote, and they'd killed to keep it secret. After lunch, Jane visited the servants' quarters, where Elsie was polishing silver, her hands trembling. "Elsie," Jane said, "that locket Clara gave you, did she say why it was lucky?" Elsie's eyes widened. "She said it was like hers, to keep me safe. I didn't understand." Jane nodded, picturing a decoy locket meant to confuse a thief. "And the pantry shadow. Any new thoughts?" Elsie shook her head, but her voice dropped. "I heard a clink, like glass, before the voice." Jane's thoughts flew to the glass dropper. Had the killer mixed the poison right there? She found Mrs. Dobbs in the kitchen checking a ledger. "Mrs. Dobbs," Jane said, "did you hear anything odd in the kitchen before the feast? A clink, maybe?" The housekeeper's face tightened. "Nothing but pots and pans, miss." But her hand gripped the ledger, and Jane sensed another dodge. She asked to see the pantry again, and Mrs. Dobbs unlocked it with a grunt. Inside, Jane noticed a small shelf, high up, with a dusty bottle of cleaning fluid. She sniffed it, catching a faint almond scent. Wrapping it in her handkerchief, she added it to her clues. Was this the cyanide sauce, mislabeled to hide its danger? Jane returned to the drawing room, where Roger was telling a story, his voice too loud. She sat quietly, her eyes on his cuff, where a button was missing, black and shiny like the one in the conservatory. "Mr. Tate," she said, "you were in the conservatory before the feast, weren't you?" Roger's smile faltered. "Just admiring the flowers, Miss Marple. but his hand brushed his cuff, and Jane knew he was lying. As evening fell, Jane sat in the library, the fire crackling, her handkerchief spread before her. The clues were mounting: powder, papers, glove, vial, letter, shovel, cloth, dropper, button, notebook, cleaning fluid. Each pointed to a killer, but the path was twisted. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a missing button had once led to a cheat. Here it led to murder, and Jane was close to the truth. Her knitting needles clicked, each stitch a step forward. A soft tap echoed again, closer, like a candle flickering out. Jane's eyes gleamed. The killer was near, and she was ready to shine a light on their face. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The snow outside Winterbrook Hall had slowed to a gentle fall, but the roads remained blocked, trapping the guests and servants in a house thick with suspicion. Miss Jane Marple sat by her bedroom window, her grey shawl snug against the evening chill, her knitting needles quiet as she studied the clues in her handkerchief. White powder from the kitchen, a locket paper with chemical symbols, a torn scrap with formula, a small key from a broken vase, a chemical page from a locked desk, a torn glove with powder, a vial labelled Sample A, a letter from Clara warning of her father's secret, a powdery smudge from a shed shovel, a stained cloth from the kitchen, a glass dropper from the shed, a conservatory button, a basement notebook, and a bottle of cleaning fluid with an almond scent. Each was a thread in the deadly tapestry of Clara Merton's murder, and Jane's sharp mind was ready to weave them into a trap to catch the killer. The house was silent, its halls dim with lamplight, but Jane felt the killer's presence, like a shadow just out of sight. The faint tap she'd heard, on glass, on wood, had grown bolder, as if the culprit sensed the net closing. Jane tucked her handkerchief into her sleeve and slipped into the corridor, her steps soft on the rugs. Tonight she would set a trap, using the Christmas Eve feast's grim memory to draw the killer out. She needed to act before the snow cleared and the police arrived, giving the murderer a chance to slip away. Jane found Lady Beatrice Harrowfield in the sitting room, her silver hair catching the fire's glow, her hands twisting a teacup. "Beatrice," Jane said, her voice low, "we must host another dinner, like the one before. Same menu, same pudding. It'll stir the killer's nerves." Beatrice's eyes widened, but she nodded, trusting Jane's plan. "I'll tell Mrs. Dobbs and Elsie to prepare it," she said. "But Jane, what if they try again?" Jane's smile was calm. "That's what I'm counting on, dear. They'll show themselves." Beatrice sent for Mrs. Dobbs, the stern housekeeper, who frowned at the idea. "Another pudding, ma'am. After what happened?" Her voice was sharp, but Jane caught a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Exactly as before," Jane said, her tone gentle but firm. "And I'd like to watch Elsie make it, to be sure." Mrs. Dobbs's lips tightened, but she agreed, leading Jane to the kitchen. Elsie was there, kneading dough, her hands trembling. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I'm scared. What if they blame me again?" Jane patted her arm. "You'll be fine, dear. Just follow your recipe, and I'll keep watch." In the kitchen, Jane stood by as Elsie mixed plums, sugar, and spices, her movements careful under Jane's gaze. The pantry was locked, but Jane asked Mrs. Dobbs to open it, checking the brandy bottle. It was new, untainted, with no almond scent. Jane nodded, satisfied, but her eyes lingered on a small jar of baking powder, its lid loose. She sniffed it, finding no trace of cyanide, but noted its place near the brandy. "Who handles the pantry key during the day?" Jane asked. Mrs. Dobbs patted her apron. "Only me, miss, always." But Jane recalled the scratch on the pantry lock, suggesting someone had tampered with it. As Elsie poured the brandy sauce, Jane watched closely, ensuring no one else touched it. Mrs. Dobbs stood by the door, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Jane's mind flashed to the stained cloth and glass dropper. Had the killer used them here, slipping poison into Clara's portion? She asked Elsie to serve the pudding herself tonight, bypassing Mrs. Dobbs. The housekeeper's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, her silence heavy. Jane returned to the main house, her thoughts on the guests, Victor Harrowfield's debts, Dr. Ernest Quill's poison knowledge, Mrs. Lavinia Gray's sharp questions, and Roger Tate's hidden grudge. All pointed to motives, but the clues needed to connect. She found Victor in the drawing room, staring at a chessboard, his fingers moving a knight aimlessly. "Mr. Harrowfield," Jane said, "Clara's locket. Did she ever show you what was inside?" Victor's hand froze, his eyes dark. "Just a picture of her father. Nothing else." But his voice was tight, and Jane recalled the letter. "I know what you did in London." Was he hiding more? She sought Dr. Quill next, finding him in the library, his nose in a book on toxins. "Dr. Quill," she said, "if someone had an antidote for cyanide, how would they use it?" He looked up, his glasses glinting. "It'd be injected fast to counter the poison. But it's rare. Clara's father was close, but—" Pure. Trailed off, his fingers twitching. Jane nodded, thinking of the vial labelled Sample A. Was it the antidote, or a trick? "Did you ever test such a thing?" she asked. Quill shook his head too quickly. "No, but I'd give anything to see it." His eyes betrayed a hunger, and Jane filed it away. In the conservatory, Jane checked the bench where she'd found the button and petal. A faint scratch on the stone caught her eye, like a knife had grazed it. She knelt, finding a tiny metal shard, sharp and thin, like part of a pen nib. She wrapped it in her handkerchief, picturing a struggle. Perhaps Mrs. Gray, whose dress matched the button, had met someone here, arguing over the formula. Jane's thoughts turned to the basement, notebook with its note, "Trust only C." Clara had guarded her father's secret, but someone had betrayed her. Dinner was set for 7, the dining room glowing with candles, the table laid with fresh linens. Beatrice had followed Jane's plan, recreating the Christmas Eve feast. Roasted, goose, spiced wine, and a new plum pudding, its brandy sauce steaming. The guests gathered, their faces tense. Victor sat stiffly, his eyes on his plate. Mrs. Gray's smirk was gone, her hands gripping her fork. Roger tried a weak joke, but his voice cracked. Dr. Quill adjusted his glasses, his gaze on the pudding. Jane sat quietly, her hands folded, watching every move. Elsie brought the pudding, her hands steady under Jane's instructions. She served each guest, her eyes darting to Jane for reassurance. Jane nodded, her gaze flicking to the brandy jug, untouched since she'd checked it. As the guests took their portions, Jane watched closely. Victor hesitated, his spoon hovering. Mrs. Gray pushed her plate away, her lips tight. Roger ate slowly, his eyes on the others. Dr. Quill's hand trembled, his fork barely touching the pudding. Jane's heart beat steady. She'd expected this. The killer would fear a trap, and their fear would show. Halfway through, Victor stood abruptly, his face pale. "I can't do this," he muttered and left the room. Jane's eyes followed him, noting his panic. Mrs. Gray whispered to Beatrice, her voice sharp. "He's cracking, isn't he? Too much guilt." Roger shushed her, his own face flushed. Dr. Quill set his spoon down, his glasses fogging. Jane spoke softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "This pudding is safe, I assure you. Elsie made it under my watch." The guests exchanged glances, but no one spoke. After dinner, Jane asked Beatrice to gather the guests in the sitting room. She had one more move to make. As they assembled, Jane stood by the fire, her shawl neat, her voice calm. "I found something today," she said, holding up the glass dropper from her handkerchief. "This was in the shed, with traces of cyanide. It was used to poison Clara's pudding." The room went still. Victor's hands clenched, his eyes wide. Mrs. Gray's face paled, her fingers twisting her purse. Roger's smile vanished, his cuff, still missing a button, trembling. Dr. Quill's glasses slipped, his voice sharp. "Where did you get that?" Jane's eyes met his, steady and knowing. "I also found this," she said, holding up the conservatory button. "It matches. A dress, I think." Mrs. Gray gasped, her hand flying to her sleeve, where a button was indeed missing. "That's not mine," she snapped, but her voice shook. Jane continued, her tone mild. "And this vial, labelled Sample A. Could it be an antidote, Doctor?" Quill's face drained of colour, his hands gripping his chair. I don't know," he stammered. The room crackled with tension. Victor stood, his voice raw. "Enough games, Miss Marple. I didn't kill her, but I know who did." He pointed at Quill. "He was after her father's formula. Clara told me he asked her for it, over and over." Quill leapt up, his glasses falling. "Lies! I only wanted to study it." Jane watched them, her mind sharp. Victor's accusation felt desperate, but Quill's panic was real. Had one of them slipped the cyanide into the sauce? Mrs. Gray's voice cut in, cold and sharp. "Victor's deflecting. He needed Clara's money. Everyone knows it." Roger stepped forward, his face grim. "Stop this, all of you. Clara's gone, and we're tearing each other apart." But Jane saw his hand brush his cuff, hiding the missing button. She spoke again, her voice soft but firm. Someone used a secret passage to reach the kitchen. Someone knew Clara's locket held her father's secret. And someone left this. She held up the notebook page with "Trust Only See." The guests froze, their eyes locked on her. Dr. Quill broke the silence, his voice shaking. I did it. I wanted the antidote formula. Clara wouldn't give it to me, so I used the cyanide from my bag, mixed it in the sauce. I thought no one would know." The room gasped, but Jane's eyes narrowed. His confession was too quick, too tidy. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a false confession had once hidden a deeper truth. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, "but I think there's more to this." She turned to Mrs. Gray. You were in the conservatory, weren't you? Meeting someone about the formula." Mrs. Gray's face hardened, but she nodded. "I wanted to buy it, yes. Clara refused, but I didn't kill her." Jane nodded, her mind on the button and the pen nib. Someone had fought in that conservatory, and Quill's confession didn't explain it all. As the guests dispersed, Jane sat with Beatrice, her voice low. "Quill's hiding something, but he's not alone. We're close, Beatrice." Her knitting needles clicked, each stitch a step toward a truth. The house creaked, and a faint tap echoed like a warning. Jane's eyes gleamed. The trap was sprung, but the real killer was still in the shadows, and she would find them before dawn. Chapter 10. The Truth Unraveled. The snow outside Winterbrook Hall had begun to melt, leaving patches of green beneath the white, but the grand estate remained a fortress of secrets. Its walls heavy with the echoes of Clara Merton's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, the fire casting a soft glow on her grey shawl, her knitting needles quiet as she studied the clues in her handkerchief. White powder from the kitchen, a locket paper with chemical symbols, a torn scrap with formula, a small key from a broken vase, a chemical page from a locked desk, a torn glove with powder, a vial labelled Sample A, a letter from Clara warning of her father's secret, a powdery smudge from a shed shovel, a stained cloth from the kitchen, a glass dropper from the shed, a conservatory button, a basement notebook, a cleaning fluid bottle with an almond, scent, a pen-nib shard, and a baking powder jar. Each was a thread in the deadly web, and Jane's sharp mind was ready to pull the final knot, revealing the killer who poisoned Clara's plum pudding. The house was quiet, the air thick with tension. After Dr. Ernest Quill's confession at the second dinner, he'd claimed to have slipped cyanide into the brandy sauce, driven by his hunger for Clara's father's antidote formula. But Jane's instincts, honed in St. Mary Mead, told her his story was too neat, a shield for the true culprit. Drum, faint tap she'd heard, on glass, on wood, had stopped, as if the killer knew the net was closing. Jane tucked her handkerchief into her sleeve and slipped into the hallway, her steps soft on the rugs. Tonight she would confront the truth, using her clues to unmask the real murderer before the snow cleared and the police arrived. Jane found Lady Beatrice Harrowfield in the library, her silver hair loose, her hands clutching a teacup. "Jane, is it true? Did Dr. Quill kill her?" Beatrice's voice trembled, her eyes searching. Jane sat beside her, her tone gentle. "He confessed, dear, but I think he's protecting someone. We need to gather everyone tonight, one last time." Beatrice nodded, her trust in Jane unwavering. "I'll call them to the drawing room," she said. "What will you do?" Jane's eyes gleamed. "Show them the truth." Beatrice sent for the guests and servants, and Jane prepared her plan. She needed to test Mrs. Lavinia Gray, whose missing button and sharp questions about the formula made her a suspect. Jane slipped to the drawing room early, where the fire burned low, casting shadows on the walls. She placed the conservatory button on the table, beside the glass dropper and the cleaning fluid bottle, arranging them like bait. Then she hid the basement notebook in a drawer, leaving it slightly ajar, as if carelessly forgotten. Her trap was set. Now she needed the killer to bite. The guests arrived, their faces drawn. Victor Harrowfield slumped in a chair, his dark eyes hollow, his hands twisting a handkerchief. Mrs. Gray stood by the window, her black dress stark, her lips tight. Roger Tate tried a weak smile, but his eyes darted to the table where the button gleamed. Dr. Quill sat stiffly, his glasses fogging, his confession hanging over him like a cloud. Mrs. Dobbs and Elsie stood by the door, the housekeeper's face stern, the cook's hands trembling. Beatrice sat near Jane, her hands folded, ready to follow her lead. Jane stood, her voice calm but firm. "We're close to the truth about Clara's death," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "Dr. Quill confessed, but I believe he's covering for someone." Quill's head snapped up, his face pale. "I told you, it was me," he said, his voice cracking. Jane raised a hand, her smile gentle. "Let's look at the clues." She held up the dropper. This carried cyanide to the brandy source, found in the shed. She pointed to the cleaning fluid bottle. This held the poison, mislabeled to hide its danger. The guests shifted, their eyes locked on the table. Jane picked up the button. This was in the conservatory, where a meeting took place, perhaps a fight. Mrs. Gray's hand flew to her sleeve, her face white. "That's not mine," she snapped, but her voice shook. Jane nodded, her gaze steady. "And this," she said, opening the drawer to reveal the notebook, "holds Clara's father's antidote formula, hidden in the basement." Roger's hand twitched, his cuff, still missing a button, visible. Victor's eyes widened, and Mrs. Dobbs's face hardened. Jane continued, her voice soft but piercing. Clara knew her father's secret, kept in her locket. Someone wanted it, badly enough to kill. She held up the locket paper, its chemical symbols faint. But they used a decoy locket, given to Elsie, to throw off a thief. Elsie gasped, her hand touching her own locket. Jane's eyes moved to Mrs. Dobbs. "And someone used a secret passage to reach the kitchen, slipping poison into Clara's sauce." The housekeeper's hands clenched, her jaw tight. Victor stood, his voice raw. "Stop this, Miss Marple. Quill did it. He said so." But Jane shook her head, her eyes on Mrs. Gray. "Mrs. Gray, you met someone in the conservatory, didn't you? About the formula." Mrs. Gray's smirk vanished, her hands trembling. I wanted to buy it, yes, but I didn't kill her." Jane nodded, then turned to Roger. "And you, Mr. Tate? Your note said you'll pay for what you took. Was it to Clara, about her father's patent?" Roger's face reddened, his voice low. "That was years ago. I didn't hurt her." Jane's gaze shifted to Mrs. Dobbs, whose stern face was like stone. "Mrs. Dobbs, you knew the passages. You kept the pantry key, but someone picked the lock." The housekeeper's eyes flashed. "I told you, miss, no one got in." But Jane saw her hand slip to her apron, where a faint clink sounded like glass. Jane's heart quickened. She held up the pen nib shard. "This was in the conservatory near a scratch. Someone fought there, and I think it was you, Mrs. Dobbs." The room gasped, and Mrs. Dobbs stepped back, her face pale. "Nonsense!" she snapped, but her voice shook. Jane pressed on, her tone calm. "You knew Clara's father, didn't you? He worked with your husband, a chemist who died in a lab accident. You blamed Clara's father, and when you learned she had his formula, you saw a chance for revenge." Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. "Is it true?" she whispered. Jane held up the cleaning fluid bottle. You hid cyanide in this, didn't you? And used the dropper to poison Clara's sauce, knowing she'd eat more. She loved pudding. Mrs. Dobbs's hands trembled, her eyes darting to the door. Jane continued, her voice steady. You gave Elsie a decoy locket to confuse anyone looking for the formula. You used the passage to slip into the kitchen, and you fought with Clara in the conservatory when she refused to give it up. The pen nib, Jane realized, was from Mrs. Dobbs's ledger pen, dropped in the struggle. Mrs. Dobbs's face crumpled, her voice a whisper. I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted the formula, to sell it, to make up for what her father took from me. He ruined my husband, left us with nothing. I put just a drop of cyanide to scare her, but... She sank to her knees, tears falling. It was too much. The room was silent, the guests frozen. Dr. Quill's shoulders slumped, his confession revealed as a lie to protect Mrs. Dobbs, his old friend from the lab days. Jane's voice was gentle, but firm. You fought with Clara, and when she wouldn't give you the formula, you poisoned her. The button was from your apron, not Mrs. Gray's dress. Jane held up the button, its black shine matching Mrs. Dobbs's uniform. The housekeeper sobbed, her hands covering her face. Beatrice stood, her voice shaking. Why, Mrs. Dobbs, you were family here. But Mrs. Dobbs only wept, her secrets laid bare. Jane turned to Quill. You knew, didn't you? You tried to take the blame to save her. Quill nodded, his glasses fogging. She told me that night, begged me to help. I couldn't let her hang. Jane's heart softened, but justice was clear. She looked to Beatrice. When the police come, they'll need everything. The dropper, the bottle, the notebook. Beatrice nodded, her face pale but resolute. The guests dispersed, their voices hushed. Victor sat stunned, his grief real but mixed with relief. Mrs. Gray's smirk was gone, her hands still. Roger stared at the fire, his secrets safe for now. Elsie clung to Beatrice, her locket a sad reminder of Clara's kindness. Jane sat by the fire, her handkerchief empty now, its clues given to Beatrice for safekeeping. The snow outside was thinning, the roads soon clear for the police. Jane thought of St. Mary Mead, where a hidden grudge had once led to a theft. Here it led to murder, driven by loss and revenge. Mrs. Dobbs's pain had twisted into poison, but Jane's sharp eyes had seen the truth. She took out her knitting, the needles clicking softly, each stitch a mark of closure. The house was quiet, the tap gone, as if the walls had exhaled. Jane sipped her tea, her mind at peace, ready to return to her village where new puzzles surely waited.